Laura Reed sat on the couch in her Brooklyn living room, her legs tucked under her. An old photo album lay open on her lap, showing her and Michael's honeymoon. She ran her finger over the image of the two of them on a beach in Malibu, laughing and hugging, their skin glistening in the California sun. Her hair had been longer then, her smile wider. She glanced at her reflection in the dark TV screen across the room. Now her chestnut curls were pulled back into a messy bun, and there were tired shadows under her eyes. The house was quiet, save for the ticking of the clock on the wall and the occasional creak of the floorboards upstairs where Oliver slept. Her 8-year-old son, the only thing she had left to connect with Michael. She closed the sketchbook, feeling something heavy in her chest, and glanced at the phone on the coffee table. Michael should have called an hour ago. Laura sighed and reached for her glass of wine. She took a sip, but the taste was bland, like everything else in her life these past few years. Working from home as a graphic designer, endless Zoom calls, school meetings, dinners made from pre-packaged food, all of this had become her reality. Somewhere out there, beyond the walls of their cozy but cold home, was another Laura, one who dreamed of exhibiting her work, dancing until the early hours, and wasn't afraid to be herself. The phone vibrated, and the screen lit up with the name Michael. Laura froze. She stood in the middle of the kitchen, holding a cup of cold tea in one hand. In the other, a phone, on the screen of which a familiar name continued to flash. The call continued. She seemed to be trying to talk herself into answering or not. Finally, gritting her teeth, she pressed the green button and brought the phone to her ear. "Hello," she said evenly, but there was a weariness in her voice that came from deep within. A familiar noise could be heard on the other end of the line, the hum of an air conditioner, distant voices. "Laura, are you okay?" Michael asked quickly, as if he was swallowing his words. He spoke in a hushed voice, almost a whisper, as if he didn't want anyone in that hotel room to hear him. "What do you think?" Laura couldn't help herself. Sarcasm cut through her voice like a thin knife. "Sorry," he exhaled after a short pause. "We had a meeting with a client. Everything dragged on. I just couldn't do it earlier." "You promised to call at 8, she reminded. "It's almost 10 now." "I know. I really tried, but, well, you know how it is." Laura got up from the table and began to walk around the room. "Of course I know. It always happens like this, Michael. Either a client or a dinner with partners or a flight. And I'm sitting here, waiting, every evening like a script. Laura," his voice grew harder, "I'm working. For you. For Oliver. For us. Doesn't that matter? Do you think I don't appreciate everything you do?" She paused at the window, steepling her fingers. "But it's not just about the money. It's about you not being here. Ever. You have no idea what it's like to wake up every day and feel like you're married to a voice on the phone." "You're exaggerating," he snapped. "It's not that bad." "Really?" Laura laughed, but the laugh was dry and bitter. "Do you remember what Oliver had in his dream today? What he told you on the phone yesterday? How he cried after school?" There was silence on the other end. "I don't remember. I've had a hard day, Laura," he said quietly. "Don't start now." "It's not starting. It's living. Every day. While you're in Chicago or Los Angeles, I'm here, in this house where everything creaks with loneliness. You knew who you were marrying. My job has always been like this, and you were okay with it. I was in love, Michael. I thought it was temporary. I believed that you wanted to be with me. And now I don't know what's more important to you, us or another contract." "Laura," he sighed, "you're being dramatic. You always do that when you're tired or, I don't know. Listen, I have a meeting in half an hour. I just wanted to hear you, to tell you that I love you, and again you." "Do you love me?" she interrupted. "You don't even notice how I disappear, Michael. A little bit every day." He remained silent. "Laura," he finally said, "I'll be back on Friday. We'll sit down and talk it over calmly, okay? Is this what you call talking? Like last time, when you checked your email over dinner and said everything would be fine? You are being unfair, and you are blind. I really have to go. Good night. Good night, she whispered, but the line was already ringing. She looked at the phone in her hand, then slowly lowered it onto the couch. Her lips were trembling. A lump was rising in her throat, but she wouldn't let herself cry. Not now, not again. On impulse, as if saving herself, she pulled the coat on over her t-shirt and jeans. Keys, wallet, none of it mattered. She just needed to get out, into the air, into the night, into a reality where she had some control. She quickly wrote a note for the nanny who was due to arrive in the morning and checked on Oliver. He was asleep, hugging a stuffed dinosaur, his blonde hair spread across the pillow. Laura adjusted the blanket, feeling a twinge of guilt at leaving him, but she left the house anyway. The streets of Brooklyn were alive despite the late hour. Couples passed by, groups of people laughing, someone walking a dog. Laura walked quickly, not thinking about the direction, until she stopped in front of a neon sign, Blue Note Lounge, a jazz club she had heard about from coworkers but had never visited. Something drew her inside today, maybe the promise of music, or just the desire to disappear into the crowd. It was warm inside, smelling of whiskey, old wood, and a hint of walnut from the varnish on the bar. A saxophonist played on a small stage, lit with a soft amber glow. His melody was as viscous as honey, curling through the air like lazy smoke. Laura sat down right at the counter, as if she wanted to hide in the semi-darkness between the bottles and the sounds of jazz. She ordered a martini, nodded her thanks, and looked around the room. Everything seemed real here. People spoke a little louder than they should have, laughed without holding back. They were alive, free, not like her, stuck between Oliver's school, phone calls, and empty words like, "for the sake of the family." First time here, a low, hoarse voice came from behind her. Laura turned around. A man stood before her, about 35, perhaps a little older. His dark hair was carelessly tousled. The sleeves of his light shirt were rolled up to his elbows. His eyes were brown, warm, and there was something soft and inviting about them. Is it that obvious? Laura tried to smile, but her lips trembled. Nervously. Well, he shrugged, leaning slightly toward her, you're holding the glass like it's a grenade, and you look like a man who's about to run away, or is waiting for someone to grab him by the shoulder and take him back home. You're observant, she muttered and took a sip. The bitterness of the alcohol burned her tongue, and it was pleasant. Jake, he said, extending his hand across the counter, owner of this little shadow theater. Laura, her fingers brushed his palm, and the touch was warm, alive. She quickly pulled her hand away. I just decided to stop by. Needed a change of air. The air in Brooklyn, he snorted, filling his glass with water from a carafe. Definitely exotic. People usually come here for other things. For the sounds. For the stories. Stories? She leaned forward a little, her shoulders relaxing. The martini was taking effect. Sure. You see that guy in the corner? Jake nodded toward the man scowling at his phone. He's been here 3 weeks at 9 sharp. Orders bourbon, looks at the stage, doesn't say a word. I know he's getting a divorce, but he puts the ring back on every night before he leaves. Laura chuckled, slightly surprised. Jake continued. And that girl by the stage, in the red skirt. He nodded toward the slender blonde leaning against the edge of the stage, came from Georgia. Says she's been singing since she was 13. Ran away from home. Afraid of being found, but still comes to the microphone once a week. Because here, on stage, she's real. And me? Laura was surprised at how easily the question came out. What do you see in me? He looked at her intently, not rudely, not intrusively, just attentively, the way those who know how to listen look. I see a woman who has so much inside her, so much that she can't hold it in anymore. And she came here because it's too quiet at home, or maybe the opposite, too noisy, but not where she needs to be. She was silent, feeling his words echo somewhere in her chest, under her ribs. You don't have to tell, he added softly. Sometimes it's enough to just sit there, drink something tart, and know that no one is asking unnecessary questions. And if you want someone to ask, Her voice was barely audible. Jake leaned closer. Then asked Laura, "It's safe here. You can be whoever you want here, even for one night." "And who are you here?" she asked, meeting his gaze. "Just Jake, the one who listens, because he's heard enough of his own story." A silence hung between them, warm and tense. Somewhere in the hall, a saxophone began to play more slowly, more intimately. "Do you often listen to women like me here?" She raised an eyebrow. "There aren't many women like you," he answered calmly. "Most come to forget, and you come to remember who you really are." She took the last sip. "What if I don't know who I am yet?" "Then you're already on the right track," Jake said, and his hand touched hers again, briefly, and this time she didn't pull away. Laura felt her heart beat faster. She wasn't ready for this conversation, this attention. It was all too vivid, too on edge. But something in his words, in his gaze, in the way he poured himself water without speaking, not looking her in the eyes so as not to scare her away, made her stay. She remained at the bar until the saxophone fell silent, until the musician bowed into the semi-darkness of the stage and disappeared behind a velvet curtain. Jake came up to her from time to time, not intruding, just pouring water, making quiet jokes, telling stories. "I used to wear suits. Imagine, a boring office, conference rooms, coffee from a machine. I even had a briefcase, can you imagine?" He chuckled and shook his head. "And one day I just woke up and realized that it was all over. I can't pretend anymore. All I wanted was to listen to music and create a space for people where they can be real." Laura listened, barely touching her martini. She didn't want to lose that clarity. "I used to draw," she said quietly, looking at her reflection in a bottle of vermouth. "Everything. People, streets, dogs on benches. Now my pencils are somewhere in a drawer under children's drawings. Sometimes I open them, look, and close them again." "Why?" he asked, almost in a whisper. "Because it's scary, that it won't work out, that I'm no longer the one who drew." He didn't answer. He just looked at her with such attention, as if her words were a fragile glass figurine, and he was afraid to break them even with a glance. When she finally got ready to leave, the club had already begun to quiet down. A few people were still sitting at tables. Someone was slowly putting on their coats. A girl near the stage was drinking water and writing something in a notebook. Jake walked her to the door. There was something old-fashioned about the gesture, touching and warm. "Come again, Laura," he said, holding the door and smiling at the corner of his lips. "There's always room for your story here, even if you don't know it yet." Laura looked up, her cheeks burning, whether from the warmth of the club or from his words. "Maybe I will come," she whispered, feeling an uncertain but living what-if rise in her chest. They stood there in silence until a car honked outside. She nodded and stepped into the night. Laura stood in front of the bedroom mirror, holding a black dress she hadn't worn in 3 years. It was simple but form-fitting, with a neckline that had once made Michael turn his head. She tried it on, looking at her reflection. The dress still fit perfectly, flattering her figure, but Laura felt like a stranger in it. Like this was a different woman, one who didn't spend her days staring at a laptop screen and fall asleep feeling empty. A week had passed since that night at the Blue Note Lounge. Laura couldn't get Jake's voice, his warm smile, the light touch of his arm out of her head. She found herself thinking about him when she was cooking dinner for Oliver or answering work emails. It was stupid, she knew. She was 35, with a son, a husband, a home. But something drew her back to that club, where the music and the lights felt alive, where she felt alive. "Mom, where are you going?" Oliver appeared in the doorway, holding his tablet in both hands like a shield. The light from the screen fell on his face, giving him a slightly alien look. His blonde hair was sticking out in all directions. His cheeks were still warm from sleep or cartoons. Laura winced. She stood in front of the mirror, adjusting an earring and fastening the strap of her shoe. She quickly pulled her robe over her fitted black dress and tried to force something resembling a smile onto her face. "Just to a meeting. With colleagues. We want to discuss a project." The voice sounded a little higher than usual. Too cheerful, too strained. Again, Oliver frowned. And you were at a meeting yesterday, too. And the day before. Not exactly. Laura squatted down in front of him, trying to catch his eye. Yesterday, yes, but not the day before. She smiled softer, reaching out to straighten his shirt, which was bunched up at the collar. I'm only going away for a little while today. You won't even notice. But I wanted you to see how I built a base in Minecraft. His voice became quieter, almost offended. Laura bit her lip. She sat down on the floor in front of him, crossing her legs. I really want to see it. Really. Will you show me tomorrow morning? I promise, no phones, no rush. We'll even make cocoa with marshmallows, and I'll come to your room in my pajamas. Right away. With cocoa and marshmallows, he nodded slowly, but his eyes did not brighten. And if you say later again, she froze. His words cut her more sharply than an adult's reproach. Not hysteria, not a whim, just a question to which she had no simple answer. I won't say later, she finally said. I'll say now, I promise. She took his hand in hers. I'm so sorry I leave so often. Sometimes, adults do strange things because they think it's right. But I hear you, and I love you very much. Oliver looked at her long, carefully, then suddenly asked, Are you sad when you leave? Laura blinked. She hadn't expected it. She wanted to say, No, of course not, but sometimes, she said. Sometimes I just want to be myself for a little while, and not just a mom. Do you know what that means? He nodded, though perhaps not completely. It's like, when I go into my tent under the table and pretend I'm not there. She laughed through the slight moisture in her eyes. Yes, that's exactly it. He thought for a moment and asked, And that uncle, with whom you meet there, is he good? Laura froze. It's not exactly a meeting as you think. We just talk. The music plays, and that's it. He helps me remember what it's like to be alive, not tired, not just a housewife or a mother. Oliver nodded again. Then okay, just don't leave forever. Okay? Laura hugged him tightly, feeling his cheek pressed against her shoulder. Never. I will always come back to you. She led him into the room, tucked the blanket in, turned off the light, and quietly closed the door. Only when she found herself in the hallway did she allow herself to breathe deeply with a taste of guilt, freedom, and something disturbingly new. The nanny, Mrs. Carter, arrived half an hour later, and Laura, with one last glance in the mirror, left the house. Brooklyn greeted her with cool evening air, smelling of asphalt and coffee from the coffee shop next door. She walked quickly, feeling her heels clicking on the sidewalk, her dress fluttering slightly in the wind. With each step, her resolve grew stronger, but somewhere deep inside, a feeling of guilt stirred. The Blue Note Lounge was full, despite the weekday evening. The saxophone flowed from the stage, soft and enveloping, like warm smoke. Laura squeezed her way to the bar, trying to ignore the curious glances. She felt out of place, too dressed up for this place, too old for a night of adventure. But when she saw Jake behind the counter, all doubts disappeared. He was wearing a dark shirt, his sleeves rolled up, and he was wiping glasses with the same easy confidence he had shown the last time. When he saw her, he smiled not just politely, but as if he had been waiting for her all evening. Laura, he said, setting his glass on the counter, I thought you'd changed your mind about coming back. I thought so myself. She sat down on a high chair, adjusting her dress. But it seems I need another breath of your air. Then you've come to the right place. Jake winked and reached for a bottle of whiskey. The same martini, or shall we try something stronger? Whiskey, Laura surprised herself with this answer. But only if you join me. He laughed, and the sound of his laughter was like a chord in a jazz melody, warm, low, infectious. Seriously, he poured 2 glasses, adding an ice cube to each. I thought you were the umbrella type. You don't know me at all. Laura took the glass, feeling her fingers tremble slightly. Maybe I'm full of surprises. Oh, I'm sure of it. Jake raised his glass, clinking it with hers. To surprises, Laura. They drank, and the whiskey burned her throat, but it felt good, like shedding a skin she had lived in for too long. The music slowed, and the saxophone gave way to a piano whose notes floated around the room like gentle rain. "Tell me about jazz," Laura said to fill the silence. "Why do you love it so much?" Jake leaned back against the counter, looking thoughtfully at the stage. "Jazz is freedom," he said. "There are no rules. You can play anything, any way you want, and it will still be beautiful. It's like life, you know. You can screw it up, but if you have a soul, you'll find a way to make it art." Laura looked at him, feeling his words touch something deep inside her. "I forgot what freedom is," she said quietly, almost against her will. "My life is a schedule. Work, son, home, everything by the hour." "A son?" Jake raised an eyebrow, but not in a judgmental tone. "How old is he?" "8, Laura smiled, thinking of Oliver. He's my world. But sometimes I feel like I'm not me anymore, like I've dissolved into him, into my husband, into this house." Jake looked at her carefully, and there was no mockery or pity in his gaze, only understanding. "You know, Laura," he said, leaning closer, "sometimes you have to get lost to find yourself. This club is my place to do it. I escaped from offices, from ties, from everything that was stifling. Maybe you need your own place, too." "Maybe," she looked away, feeling her cheeks burn. "But I'm not sure I'm ready to run." "You don't have to run away," Jake smiled. "Sometimes just dancing is enough." He nodded toward the small dance floor, where several couples were moving slowly to the music. Laura laughed, shaking her head. "I don't dance. Not like before." "Then let me remind you." He extended his hand to her, his fingers warm as she hesitantly placed her palm in his. They stepped onto the dance floor, and Laura felt her heart beat faster. Jake placed his hand on her waist, his touch light but firm. They moved to the beat of the music, and Laura realized how long it had been since she had felt so desirable. His breath brushed her temple, and she closed her eyes, letting the music carry her away. "You dance well," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "Why did you stop?" "Life," she said, opening her eyes. Their faces were so close, she could see the dark lashes framing his eyes. "It complicates everything." "Then make it easy," he said, his hand squeezing her waist lightly. "Just for one night." Laura didn't have time to answer. He leaned down, and his lips found hers, softly but with a force that made her world spin. The kiss was slow but deep, like the whiskey they were drinking, and Laura felt her body respond despite the voice in her head screaming that this was wrong. She pulled away, gasping, her eyes wide. I need to go," she muttered, stepping back. "Laura," Jake didn't try to stop her, but his voice was soft, almost pleading. "You didn't do anything wrong. It was just a dance." "It wasn't just a dance," she shook her head, feeling her cheeks burn. "You know that." He smiled, but there was a shadow of sadness in his smile. "Then come tomorrow. I'll be here." Laura didn't answer. She almost ran out of the club, her heels clicking on the wooden floor. Outside, the cold air hit her face, but it couldn't cool the heat that still burned in her chest. She walked home, and every step was a fight with herself. She wanted to go back, wanted to feel this again, but the image of Oliver asleep in his bed was stronger. At home, she quietly entered his room. Oliver was asleep, hugging his dinosaur, and Laura sat next to him, looking at his face. Her fingers trembled as she adjusted his blanket. She felt like a traitor not just to Michael, but to her son. But somewhere deep down, she knew she would go back to that club. Not tomorrow, maybe in a few days, but she would go back. Laura sat at the kitchen table, staring at her laptop screen. She was supposed to be finishing a logo mock-up for a client, but her mind was elsewhere than fonts and color palettes. It had been a week since that night at the Blue Note Lounge, when Jake had kissed her on the dance floor, and since then her life had felt like it had split in two. One part of her was still here, in this house in Brooklyn, with Oliver sleeping upstairs and Michael calling once a day from yet another business trip. The other part, the one that woke up at night with her heart pounding, belonged to Jake and his club, where the music and his touch made her feel alive. She closed her laptop and looked at the clock. 8:30. Oliver was already asleep, and Mrs. Carter, their nanny, was leafing through a magazine in the living room. Laura grabbed her phone and quickly typed out a message. "I'm at the club in an hour. Design course." She sent it to Michael, knowing he wouldn't check. He never checked. Her lie was so simple, so convenient, that Laura almost believed it herself. Design course, as if she could go back to her old yokel. System, old pencils that were lying in a chest of drawers. Laura put on the black dress, the same one she had worn last time, and looked at herself in the mirror. Her reflection looked alien, her eyes were bright, her cheeks slightly flushed, as if she had already been there, at the club, under Jake's gaze. She put on red lipstick, something she hadn't done in years, and walked out of the house, her heart pounding with anticipation and guilt. Let's get to know each other better. Write what city you are from, and have you or your friends had similar stories. The Blue Note Lounge greeted her with its familiar warmth and the smell of whiskey. The saxophonist on stage was playing something slow and mournful, and Laura felt the tension in her shoulders ease. She looked for Jake and found him at the bar, mixing a drink for a girl in a sparkly top. When he saw Laura, he smiled the same smile that made her knees weak. "You're back," he said, placing the cocktail in front of the girl and walking over to Laura. "I knew you couldn't resist." "Don't be so sure," Laura tried to smile, but her voice trembled. "Maybe I'm just for the whiskey." "Oh, you did." Jake pressed his hand to his chest, but his eyes were laughing. "Sit down, I know what you need." He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, added an ice cube, and handed one to her. "What are we drinking to?" Laura asked, feeling the warmth of his gaze envelop her. "To the nights that belong only to us." He clinked glasses with hers, his fingers lightly touching her hand. Laura took a sip, feeling the whiskey burn her throat. She couldn't take her eyes off Jake, his dark hair, slightly tousled, his warm brown eyes, the way his shirt hugged his broad shoulders. He was the complete opposite of Michael, cold, calculating, always in an impeccable suit. Jake was alive, real, like the jazz that played behind them. "Tell me something about yourself," she said, to distract herself from thoughts that were leading too far. "Have you always been a club owner?" "No," he chuckled, taking a sip of whiskey. "I used to be one of those guys in ties, sitting in an office, hating his life. But one day, I just walked away, bought this club, and here I am. Free." "Free," Laura repeated the word as if tasting it. "What does it feel like?" "It's like breathing." He leaned closer, his voice quieter. "Like you're finally living by your own rules. And you, Laura, when was the last time you breathed?" She froze, feeling his words hit her right in the heart. I don't remember," she admitted, looking into her glass. "My life is Oliver, Michael, work. I forgot how to be myself." "Then let me remind you," he said, and his hand covered hers on the counter. His fingers were warm, and Laura felt her skin heat up at the touch. "Jake, I'm married." The words came out on their own, but there was no power in them. "I know." He didn't remove his hand, but his gaze became more serious. "But you're here. Not with him." Laura opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat. He was right. She was here because she wanted to be here, because she wanted him. The music changed to something more rhythmic, and Jake stood up, walking around the counter. "Come on," he said, holding out his hand to her. "Let's dance." "I don't," she began, but he was already pulling her towards the dance floor. "No objections," he smiled, and Laura couldn't resist. They began to dance, and his hands came to her waist, pulling her closer. Laura could feel the heat of his body, his breath on her temple, and her heart was beating so loudly it drowned out the music. They moved slowly, but every step was charged with electricity. His fingers slid lower, to her hips, and Laura gasped, feeling her body respond to his touch. "You're shaking," he whispered, his lips touching her ear. "Because I'm afraid," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "It's wrong." "What's right?" His hand moved up to her back, pulling her even closer. Live as if you're dead? Laura, you deserve better. She looked into his eyes, and there was so much fire in them that she felt like she was drowning. He leaned down, and his lips found hers, softly at first, testing, then deeper, more insistent. The kiss was like whiskey, scorching, intoxicating, making you forget everything. Laura wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing closer, and felt his hands slide down her back, burning her skin even through the fabric of her dress. "Let's go upstairs," he whispered, pulling away, his breathing heavy. Laura froze, her mind screaming that this was a mistake, but her body had already made its choice. She nodded, and he led her through the crowd to the stairs in the corner of the club. They climbed up to his loft, a small apartment above the club, with large windows looking out onto the Brooklyn skyline at night. The room smelled of leather and wood, and Laura barely had time to look around before Jake closed the door and pulled her into his arms. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice hoarse, and there was something in his eyes that made her heart clench, not just desire, but concern. "No," she answered honestly, but her hands were already tugging at his shirt. "But I can't stop." He kissed her again, and this time there was such passion in his kiss that Laura felt her world crumble. His hands slid under her dress, and she gasped as his fingers touched her skin. They fell onto the couch, and Laura forgot about everything Michael, Oliver, her life. There were only his lips, his hands, his warmth. Their intimacy was quick, but not rushed. Every gesture was full of desire, but also something more, something Laura couldn't name. She felt alive, wanted, free. When it was over, they lay there, breathing heavily, and Laura stared at the ceiling, feeling reality creep back in. Jake lay next to her, his arm around her waist, his breath warm on her neck. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. "I don't know." Laura turned to him, her eyes full of confusion. It, it was incredible, but I don't know who I am now." "You are Laura," he smiled, running his finger down her cheek. "A woman who deserves to be happy." She went to answer, but her phone vibrated in her purse. She pulled it out, and the screen lit up with a message from an unknown number. "You're playing with fire." Laura froze, her heart skipping a beat. "What's wrong?" Jake sat up, noticing her reaction. "Nothing." She quickly put the phone away, trying to smile. "Just spam." But her voice was shaking. She stood up, straightening her dress, and looked at Jake. "I have to go," she said. "Oliver, I have to be home." "Laura," he stood up, taking her hand. "You don't have to run away. Talk to me." "I'm not running away," she shook her head, but her eyes were full of fear. "Just give me time." He nodded without insisting and walked her to the door. Outside, Laura took a breath of the cold air, trying to calm her racing heart. The message wouldn't leave her mind. Who could have known? It was impossible. Just a coincidence, she told herself, but anxiety squeezed her chest. It was quiet at home. Too quiet, even. Mrs. Carter was asleep on the sofa, curled up in her warm knitted cardigan. Her glasses had slipped to the tip of her nose, and an open book was swinging peacefully over her stomach. Laura quietly approached, and, trying not to wake her, covered her with a blanket. "Thank you," she whispered, barely audible. "Thank you for staying again, for not asking too much." For her kindness still keeping Laura from losing herself completely. She walked up the stairs, walking slowly, as if each step took her further away from the evening, from the club, from Jake. At the threshold of Oliver's room, she stopped. He was asleep, curled up, with his favorite stuffed dinosaur pressed to his chest. His cheeks were pink, his lips parted. His face was serene, childlike, so vulnerable that Laura's heart sank painfully. She sat down on the edge of the bed, slightly shaking the mattress. Oliver did not wake up, but stirred, whispering something in his sleep. And suddenly a flash, a memory of a nightmare. He stood in the middle of her dream, Oliver, but not like this. Older, too serious. His eyes were full of pain. "Why did you leave?" he asked then. "Why did you choose someone else and not me?" Laura squeezed her eyelids shut, trying to push the image away. It was just a dream. But the lump in her throat was real, and the feeling of guilt, dull and sticky, enveloped her like a blanket of metal. She leaned down and kissed Oliver on the temple. "I'm here, baby. I'm always near." In her bedroom, Laura changed slowly, as if every movement brought her back to reality. The cold of the sheets didn't frighten her. Her body still bore traces of Jake. The warmth of his palms, the weight of his gaze, the taste of his breath. It wasn't just a touch, it was a touch of something long lost. Of herself. Of the Laura who once dreamed, painted, felt. She lay down without turning on the light. She lay on her back, looking into the darkness where the ceiling used to be, but now there was emptiness, full of thoughts. She wanted to hate herself. She wanted to call everything that had happened a mistake, a weakness, a betrayal. But she couldn't. What happened between her and Jake was too real, too alive. It wasn't a fairy tale, it wasn't love, but it was an awakening. Like a long dream in which she was a stranger to herself. The phone vibrated. Laura turned sharply to the nightstand, but the screen was blank. She opened the message she had received an hour ago again. "You're playing with fire." The letters were cold and clear. No signature. The number was blocked, anonymous. Not Jake, definitely not him. And not Michael. She would recognize the style. Michael would not speak in hints. He would either remain silent or attack head-on. She looked at the screen as if it were an ice hole. There was something frightening about her. Question, who knows? Froze in my head. Perhaps someone saw. Perhaps someone guesses. Perhaps my conscience just decided to speak in a different voice. But Laura felt that the line had been crossed. There was no turning back. She turned off the screen and lay back down, pulling the blanket up to her chin. The darkness was thick, the silence ringing. There was no usual ringing of worries and affairs in her head. There were no voices of relatives. There was not even guilt tearing her apart from within. There was only the saxophone, its velvety, slow voice hovering over her body, over her skin, over her past. And Jake's voice is deep, calm, but sharply dangerous. "There's always room for your story here." Laura clutched the sheet in her fist. Her story had truly begun. But now she wasn't sure who was the hero, and who was the arsonist. And somewhere deep inside, in the darkness, her soul whispered, "You are playing with fire." But the flame had already touched the fingertips, and it was too late to retreat. Laura sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steaming cup of coffee she hadn't touched. The morning light poured through the window, casting long shadows across the floor, but her thoughts were far from this cozy Brooklyn home. It had been 2 weeks since she'd first stepped into the Blue Note Lounge, and since then her life had been a strange dance between duty and desire. By day, she was Oliver's mother, Michael's wife, a graphic designer who answered emails from clients. But at night, when she slipped away to the club, she was someone else a woman Jake looked at with such a fire in his eyes that she forgot how to breathe. Michael had returned from Chicago last night. Laura had met him at the airport, smiling through her teeth as he described his meeting with clients. His voice was smooth, businesslike, as always, but Laura had noticed the way he looked at her, his eyes slightly narrowed, as if trying to figure out what had changed. She knew he sensed her distance, but she couldn't bring herself to be the same. Not when her skin still remembered Jake's touch, and his words, "You deserve more," sounded in her head like the chorus of a jazz tune. "Laura, are you listening to me?" Michael's voice pulled her out of her thoughts. She blinked, looking up. He was standing at the stove, holding a frying pan of eggs he was preparing for Oliver. His dark hair was neatly combed, his shirt pressed the perfect lawyer, even on a Saturday morning. "Yes, of course," she lied, sipping her cold coffee. "You were talking about a new client." "I was saying that I wanted to have an evening for us." Michael put the frying pan on the table and sat down opposite her. "Just the two of us. Oliver can stay at Mrs. Carter's. I've made reservations at the River Cafe. Remember how we used to go there when we first started dating?" Laura felt her stomach clench. The River Cafe, the site of their first date, where Michael, then a law student, had told her of his dreams with such passion that she had fallen in love. Now it seemed distant, like a foreign life. "That's sweet," she said, trying to smile. But I'm not sure I can. I have a deadline for a project, and— Laura, he interrupted, his voice firmer. You're always busy. Work, Oliver, some courses. When was the last time you thought about us? She looked at him, and there was something in his blue eyes she hadn't seen in a long time, not just irritation, but pain. She wanted to reach out, touch him, tell him that everything would be like before, but instead she looked away. I think about us, she said quietly. It's complicated. Difficult. Michael leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. You're not even looking at me, Laura. You're somewhere else. What's going on with you? Nothing. She stood up, putting her cup in the sink to avoid his gaze. I'm just tired, Michael. That's all. He was silent, and the silence was heavy as concrete. Laura felt his gaze on her back, and she wanted to scream, to confess everything about Jake, about the club, about how she was drowning in her desires. But instead she said, I'll go check on Oliver. Laura, his voice stopped her at the door. I'm trying, but you have to meet me halfway. She nodded without turning around and walked out of the kitchen, her heart pounding and a lump in her throat. She knew he was right, but she couldn't bring herself to go back to him. Not when the other part of her life, the secret, forbidden one, was the only thing that made her feel alive. The evening at the River Cafe was flawless, as was everything Michael did. A table by the window overlooking Manhattan, candles, soft lighting. Laura wore the navy dress he had once given her and tried to smile as the waiter poured wine. But every sip, every look from Michael reminded her of another place, another man. Do you remember how we danced here? Michael smiled, looking at her over the top of his glass. You tripped and I caught you. Everyone laughed. Yes, Laura forced a smile. It was a long time ago. Not that long ago, he reached out, covering her palm. Laura, I know I've been busy. Work, travel, but I want us to be close again, like before. His touch was warm, familiar, but Laura felt her body tense. She wanted to say something warm, something right, but the words stuck. Instead, she pulled her hand away, pretending to straighten her napkin. Michael, I appreciate it, she said quietly, but I don't know how to go back. His face changed. The smile disappeared, and a cold spark appeared in his eyes. Go back? He leaned closer, lowering his voice. Laura, are you even here? You're sitting across from me, but I feel like you're somewhere else. You've disconnected from our marriage. That's not true, her voice wavered, but she knew he was right. I need time. Time? He almost laughed, but there was no joy in his laughter. 10 years, Laura. 10 years I've been working so that we have everything, and you can't even look me in the eye. Don't start. She clenched her fists under the table. You think this is easy? Being here alone while you're on your business trips? I'm not just your wife, Michael. I'm a person. Then act like a human being. His voice became sharper. And not like a ghost that haunts our house. Laura felt tears stinging her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She stood up, throwing her napkin on the table. I need to go to the bathroom, she muttered and quickly left without looking back. In the bathroom, she leaned against the wall, closing her eyes. Her breathing was heavy, and her heart was pounding like it wanted to burst out of her chest. She couldn't pretend anymore. Michael tried, but she couldn't pretend back. Not when her thoughts were full of Jake, his voice, his hands, his promise of freedom. She took out her phone and texted Jake, I'm at the club in an hour. The answer came almost immediately, waiting for you. The Blue Note Lounge was like a sanctuary. The music, the lights, the smell of whiskey, it all wrapped around Laura like a warm blanket. She walked in without looking back and immediately found Jake behind the bar. He smiled when he saw her, and there was something in his eyes that made her forget about her fight with Michael. Bad evening, he asked, pouring her whiskey without further ado. You could say that. Laura took the glass, her fingers shaking slightly. It's just, everything is falling apart. Then let me fix it. He walked around the counter and sat down next to her, his knee lightly touching hers. You look like you need to run. Run away? She smiled, but there was longing in her voice. Where to? I have a son, a home, a life. For the weekend, he said, his voice quieter, conspiratorial. I know a place in the Catskills, a little house by the lake. Just you and me and silence. No obligations, no calls, just freedom. Laura froze, looking at him. His offer was like a shot, tempting, dangerous, impossible. She imagined herself there, with him, away from everything. But then an image of Oliver popped into her head. His blonde hair, his dinosaur, his voice calling Mom. I can't, she said, shaking her head. Oliver, he needs me. And you? Jake leaned closer, his hand resting on her thigh. What do you need, Laura? She didn't respond. His touch was like a spark, and she felt her body respond despite the storm in her head. She wanted to drown her guilt, her fear, her pain, and Jake was the only one who could give it to her. Let's go, she whispered, and he didn't ask any questions. They went up to his loft, and as soon as the door closed, Laura pulled him to her. Their kiss was fierce, almost desperate, as if she were trying to erase everything that had happened that evening. His hands slid under her dress, and she gasped as he pressed her against the wall. Their intimacy was brief but intense, Laura clinging to him as if he were her salvation. Every gesture, every whisper drove away thoughts of Michael, of Oliver, of what she had destroyed. But when it was over and she lay in his arms, the guilt returned like a cold wind. Stay, Jake said, his voice soft but insistent. I can't. Laura stood up, straightening her dress. I need to go home. He didn't argue, but his gaze was heavy, as if he knew she was fighting not only with him, but with herself as well. Michael was sitting in the living room when Laura came home. The lights were dim, and he was holding her purse. Laura froze when she saw him. Where have you been? His voice was calm, but there was steel in it. At the courses, she lied, but her voice wavered. He pulled a crumpled check with the Blue Note Lounge logo out of his purse and placed it on the table. Courses, huh? He looked at her, and his eyes were cold. I'll come get you tomorrow, Laura. I need to know what's going on. She opened her mouth, but found no words. She simply nodded and went upstairs, feeling her world crumble. Laura lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her body still remembered Jake, but her mind was filled with fear. Michael knew. Not all, but enough. And yet she couldn't stop. She closed her eyes, and Oliver's image came to her mind, his smile, his trust. She promised herself she would protect him. But how could she when she didn't know who she was anymore? Laura sat on the leather couch in Jake's loft, her fingers fiddling with the hem of the black dress that had become her uniform for these secret nights. The loft's windows looked out onto the Brooklyn skyline at night, where the lights of the buildings and streetlights merged into a shimmering mosaic. Downstairs, the Blue Note Lounge played music, a muted saxophone that thrummed through the floor like a distant pulse. Jake stood at the bar in the corner of the room, pouring whiskey into 2 glasses. His movements were easy, confident, but Laura noticed something new in them, a subtle tension, as if he were watching her every glance. It had been almost a month since their first meeting, and Laura couldn't stop. She returned to the club again and again, each time finding an excuse for Michael: design courses, a meeting with a client, a friend invited me. The lies flowed from her so naturally that sometimes she believed them herself. At home, she was Laura Reed Oliver's mother, Michael's wife, the woman who kept everything under control. But here, with Jake, she was different, a woman whose eyes sparkled, whose skin came alive under his touch. These nights were her refuge, her rebellion against the emptiness that squeezed her heart. But each time she felt the line between these 2 worlds grow thinner, and the fear that everything would collapse grew inside her. Jake came over, holding out a glass to her. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, his shirt unbuttoned to the top button, revealing the tan skin of his neck. He smiled, but Laura noticed that his smile was not as open as it had been before. You seem a little thoughtful today, he said, sitting down next to her. His knee brushed against hers, and even that light touch made her heart skip a beat. Is something wrong? Laura took the glass, but didn't take a sip. She looked at him, trying to figure out what had changed. Jake had been asking strange questions lately about Michael's work, his clients, how often he traveled. Last week, as they lay in his bed, he'd asked if Michael worked with large investment funds. Laura had waved it off, saying she didn't care, but the question had stuck in her head like a splinter. Just tired, she replied, trying to sound casual. Work, Oliver, you know. Oliver, Jake nodded, taking a sip of whiskey. Tell me about him. What's he like? Laura smiled, thinking of her son. The image of him, blonde hair, a stuffed dinosaur clutched to his chest, was the only thing keeping her from completely immersing herself in this forbidden world. He's special, she said, her voice softening. He loves to draw, especially dinosaurs. He has a whole notebook of stories about them. Sometimes he tells me about a T-Rex saving the world, and I think how lucky I am to have him. Sounds like a nice guy, Jake smiled, but his gaze was attentive, almost scrutinizing. And your husband? He's probably proud of him. Laura tensed. Jake had mentioned Michael again, and it wasn't the first time. Yesterday, he'd asked if Michael often met with clients like Thompson Investments. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now his questions seemed too pointed. Michael's busy, she said, trying to keep her voice even. He's working a lot. Yeah, you said that. Jake put his glass down and leaned closer. It must be tough, being alone while he's out there making millions. Not millions, Laura chuckled, but her laugh was strained. He's a lawyer, not a tycoon. Still, Jake shrugged, his hand coming to rest on her thigh. Guys like that usually work with the big shots. Funds, investments, stuff like that. It's big money, right? Laura looked at him, and her stomach dropped. His tone was light, almost casual, but there was something in his eyes that made her wary. Why do you ask? Her voice was quieter than she intended. I'm just curious, he smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. I want to know about your life, about what surrounds you. Laura looked away, feeling the unease rise inside her. She wanted to believe him, wanted to drown in his warmth like she had before. But something was wrong. She remembered him asking last week if Michael kept the papers at home. She had thought it was just chatter, but now. Come on, Jake said, standing and holding out his hand to her. His voice was soft but insistent. Stop thinking. Let's just be. Laura wanted to refuse, but his gaze, warm, inviting, was stronger than her hesitation. She took his hand, and he pulled her close, his lips finding her neck. She gasped as his fingers slid under the hem of her dress, and her body responded despite the voice in her head screaming that something was wrong. They fell onto the couch, and his kisses grew deeper, more insistent. Laura clung to his shirt, her fingers shaking as she undid the buttons. Their closeness was bold, almost violent. She could feel his hands burning her skin, his breath mingling with hers. She wanted to drown in this, to forget her fears, Michael, Oliver. But as his lips slid to her shoulder, her gaze fell to the table in the corner. There was a folder she hadn't noticed before. On the cover was printed Thompson Investments. It was Michael's biggest client, one he'd mentioned a couple of times over dinner. Laura froze, her breathing hitching. Jake sensed her tension and pulled back, looking at her with mild surprise. What happened? He asked, his voice hoarse with desire. Nothing, Laura tried to smile, but her eyes darted to the folder again. I need some water. She stood up, straightening her dress, and walked to the desk, pretending to look for a glass. Her fingers brushed against the folder, and she quickly opened it while Jake straightened his shirt. There were documents inside, spreadsheets of numbers, graphs, names. She caught a glimpse of Michael's name written in the corner of one page, and her heart skipped a beat. There were notes about his clients, about deals, about dates. This couldn't be a coincidence. Laura, Jake's voice was closer than she expected, and she flinched, slamming the folder shut. He was standing behind her, his gaze colder than usual. What are you doing? Nothing, she turned, trying to sound casual. I just saw the folder. What is it? Business, He shrugged, but his eyes never left her face. Nothing interesting. Partners, investors. The club needs money, you know. Thompson Investments. Laura couldn't help herself. He's my husband's client. Seriously? Jake raised his eyebrows, but his surprise seemed feigned to her. It's a small world. Jake, she stepped closer, her voice shaking. Why do you have papers with Michael's name on them? He was silent for a second, and that second felt like an eternity. Then he smiled, but it was a strained smile. Laura, you're overthinking it, he said, taking her hand. These are just papers. One of my partners probably works with the same people as your husband. Coincidence. Coincidence? She pulled her hand away, her heart pounding. You asked about him, about his work, about his clients. This doesn't seem like a coincidence. Hey, he raised his hands in surrender. I'm just trying to get to know you better. Your life, your family. That's okay, right? Laura wanted to believe him, but her gut was screaming at her. She remembered the strange message she'd received last week. You're playing with fire. She'd written it off as spam, but now. Her phone vibrated in her purse, and she pulled it out, her fingers shaking. There was a new message on the screen from an unknown number. He's using you. Laura froze, her breathing ragged. She quickly put the phone away, but Jake noticed. Who is it? He asked, his voice calm, but with a hint of steel in it. Nobody. Laura shoved the phone into her purse, her voice higher than usual. Just spam. Laura, he stepped closer, his hand on her shoulder. Do you trust me? She looked into his eyes, and there was something in them that made her heart clench. She wanted to say yes, wanted to drown in his warmth, like she had done before. But the folder, the message, his questions, it all formed a picture she was afraid to understand. I don't know, she admitted, her voice barely audible. Jake nodded as if he expected this and stepped back. His face became more serious, but he didn't look angry. Then think about it, he said, and there was a cold distance in his voice. I'm here when you decide. Laura wanted to say something, but the words were stuck. She grabbed her purse and walked out of the loft, her heels clicking on the wooden stairs. At the club, she pushed through the crowd, feeling her chest tighten with panic. Outside, the cold air hit her face, but it did nothing to calm her thoughts. She pulled out her phone and opened the message again. He's using you. The number was blocked, just like last time. Laura clutched the phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She wanted to believe that this was a mistake, but her gut told her otherwise. The house was quiet. Mrs. Carter had gone, leaving a note that Oliver was asleep. Laura went up to his room, and her heart sank when she saw him hugging his stuffed dinosaur. She sat on the edge of the bed, looking at his face, and the guilt washed over her with renewed vigor. She remembered the nightmare she had had last week, Oliver looking at her reproachfully, his eyes full of pain. She closed her eyes, pushing the image away, but it did not go away. Laura went to bed, but she couldn't sleep. Her body still remembered Jake, his hands, his lips, his warmth. But her mind was full of questions. Who was sending these messages? Why did Jake have documents with Michael's name on them? She wanted to believe that he was sincere, that his feelings for her were real. But her doubts were stronger. She was lost in a maze, and she didn't know how to find her way out. Laura stood by the living room window, looking out onto the dark Brooklyn street. The streetlights cast long shadows across the asphalt, and she thought she saw one of them move, or was it just the wind, shaking the branches? She pulled her cardigan tighter around her, feeling the chill creep beneath her skin. It had been a day since that unsettling night in Jake's loft, when she'd seen the file with Michael's client's name on it and received the text, "He's using you." Her nerves had been on edge ever since. She tried to convince herself it was a coincidence, that her imagination was playing tricks on her, but she couldn't let go. Someone knew about her secret, and that someone was watching her. The house was quiet. Oliver was asleep upstairs, and Michael was in his office, the light from under the door barely filtering into the hallway. After their argument in the restaurant, he had become colder, not angry, not rude, but just distant. His gaze, once warm, was now like ice, and Laura felt the gap between them growing. She wanted to talk, to explain, but the words stuck in her throat. How to explain something she herself did not understand? Her affair with Jake had been like a fire. It burned away her guilt, her loneliness, but now she was beginning to suspect that this fire could destroy everything. Laura pulled out her phone and opened the message she'd received yesterday. "He's using you." The number was blocked, like the last one. She clutched the phone so tightly her fingers turned white, and her gaze darted to the window again. The street was empty, but she couldn't help but feel like she was being watched. She remembered walking home from the club yesterday and noticing a dark sedan parked 2 blocks away. It had driven away when she turned around, but her heart had skipped a beat. "Laura, are you going to bed?" Michael's voice came from the hallway, and she jumped, almost dropping the phone. "Yes, right now," she said, trying to sound calm. She turned to see him standing in the doorway, tall, wearing an immaculate shirt, with dark circles under his eyes. He looked tired, but there was something else in his gaze, a suspicion he made no attempt to hide. "Are you okay?" he asked, but there was no warmth in his voice. "You've been on edge all evening." "Just tired." Laura looked away, feeling her cheeks burn. "Work, Oliver, you know." "I know," he nodded, but his eyes narrowed. "You often leave in the evenings. These courses of yours, they never seem to end." Laura felt her throat tighten. She knew he'd found the receipt from the Blue Note Lounge. He hadn't mentioned it since that night, but his silence spoke louder than words. "They help me," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "I need something of my own." "Something of my own," Michael repeated her words, and there was bitterness in his voice. "And we, me, Oliver, we're not yours anymore?" "Michael, don't start." Laura took a step toward him, but stopped when she saw how he tensed. "I'm trying, but you're never here. You're always on your business trips, on your own business. And you're always somewhere else." He stepped closer, his voice quieter but harsher. "Even when you're home, Laura, you're not here. I can see it. Oliver can see it." Her heart sank at the mention of Oliver. She wanted to protest, to say that she was a good mother, that she was doing everything for her son, but the words stuck. Instead, she turned and walked toward the stairs. "I'm going to bed," she threw over her shoulder without looking back. Michael didn't answer, but she felt his eyes on her as she climbed up. She closed the bedroom door and leaned against the wall, breathing hard. She needed to talk to Jake to find out what was going on. The file, the messages, his questions, none of this could be an accident. But the thought of seeing him again filled her with both fear and desire. The next night, Laura was back at the Blue Note Lounge. She told Michael she was going on a course, but his cold gaze told her he no longer believed her. The club greeted her with its familiar warmth, the smell of whiskey, the soft lighting, the sounds of piano that drifted around the room like smoke. Laura found Jake at the bar, mixing a drink, his movements as confident as ever. But when he saw her, his smile was a little strained. "You're back," he said, setting a cocktail in front of another customer. "I thought you'd changed your mind." "I need to talk to you." Laura sat down on a high chair, her fingers clenching her purse. "About what happened yesterday." "Yesterday?" He raised an eyebrow, pouring her a whiskey without asking. "You mean when you almost ran away from my loft?" "I didn't run away." She looked him in the eye, trying not to give in to his charm. "I saw the file, Jake, with the name of my husband's client, and you asked too many questions about him." He froze for a second, but quickly regained his casual expression. "Laura, you're overthinking it," he said, setting his glass down in front of her. "It's just business. My partners work with a lot of people. Coincidences happen." "It's not a coincidence." Her voice was firmer than she expected. "You asked about his clients, about his trips. Why?" "Because I want to know you." He leaned closer, his voice quieter. "Your life, your problems. It's normal, isn't it?" "No," Laura shook her head. "This isn't okay. You're hiding something, Jake. I want to know what." He looked at her, and his eyes were dark, impenetrable. Then he smiled, but the smile was cold. "You don't trust me," he said, and it wasn't a question. "I don't know who to trust," she admitted, her voice shaking. I feel like I'm going crazy." "Then let me help you." He took her hand, and his fingers were warm, but Laura felt cold. "Let's go upstairs. Let's talk in private." She wanted to refuse, but his eyes, his voice, were like a magnet. She nodded, and they went up to his loft. It was quiet, only the distant sounds of music filtering through the floor. Jake closed the door, and Laura felt her heart beat faster. "Tell me," she said, standing at the window. "Who are you, Jake? I don't know anything about you." "I'm the one who sees you." He stepped closer, but stopped when he saw her tension. "The one who wants you to be happy." "Then why do you have documents with Michael's name on them?" She turned to him, her eyes full of challenge. "Why are you asking about his work?" "Laura," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not what you think. I have partners who do investments. Sometimes their business intersects with other people's business. That's all." "Is that all?" She stepped toward him, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "Then why do I feel like you're using me?" The word use hung in the air like a gunshot. Jake froze, his face growing serious. "Do you really think so?" he asked quietly. "After everything that happened between us?" Laura was about to answer, but her phone vibrated in her purse. She pulled it out, and her blood ran cold. A new message from an unknown number. "He's not who he says he is." She clutched the phone, her fingers shaking. "Who is it?" Jake stepped closer, his voice sharp. "Nobody." Laura put the phone away, but her voice gave her away. "Just spam." "Laura," he took her by the shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "If you don't trust me, tell me, but don't play these games." "These aren't games," she broke away, her eyes blazing. "I want the truth, Jake. Who are you? What do you want?" He was silent, and his silence was louder than any words. Then he stepped back, his face unreadable. "I'm the one who wants you," he said, but his voice was colder than before. "But if you don't believe me, maybe you should leave." Laura felt her throat tighten. She wanted to stay, wanted to believe him, but the messages, the file, his evasiveness, it was all too much. She grabbed her purse and walked out, her footsteps echoing in the loft. Out on the street, she turned around and thought she saw a shadow around the corner, a man in a dark jacket, who quickly disappeared. Her heart started beating faster, and she quickened her pace, fear clenching her chest. Meanwhile, Michael sat in his office, looking at the photos the private detective had sent him. He'd hired him after finding the club receipt, and now his suspicions were confirmed. The pictures showed Laura walking into the Blue Note Lounge, and a man next to her, tall, dark-haired, too close to her. The detective, an older man named Frank, had called him an hour ago. "His name is Jake Carter," Frank said, his voice thick with cigarette smoke. "He owns the club, but he's not that simple. He has connections with people who are involved in, well, not exactly legal business. Possibly fraud. I'd advise caution, Mr. Reed." Michael clutched the phone, his jaw tensing. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I mean, your wife might be involved in something dangerous," Frank coughed. "I saw her go into his loft. There, close." Michael felt his blood boil. He wanted to storm into the bedroom, throw the photos in Laura's face, demand an explanation. But instead he said, "Keep watching. I want to know everything." "I understand," Frank replied. "But, Mr. Reed, be prepared. This may not be just a romance." Michael hung up and looked at the photographs. His fingers tightened on the edge of the table, but he forced himself to calm down. He wouldn't spill the beans yet. But when he looked at Laura, who had come home that night, his gaze was colder than ever. Laura lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her thoughts were a jumbled Jake, his evasiveness, the texts, the shadow on the street. She knew she was being watched, and that scared her more than she wanted to admit. But what scared her even more was the thought that Jake might not be who he said he was. She closed her eyes, but instead of sleep, the image of Oliver, his trusting eyes, came to her. She promised herself she would protect him. But how could she, when she didn't know what she was getting herself into? Laura sat on the edge of the couch in Jake's loft, her fingers clutching the hem of her dress so tightly the fabric was bunched up. Outside, Brooklyn was ablaze with lights, but the room was dark, with only the dim light of a lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The music from the Blue Note lounge downstairs was muffled, a distant echo, but Laura could barely hear it. Her mind was elsewhere, the folder with Michael's client's name on it that she'd seen last week, Jake's strange questions about his work, and the text that had come from unknown numbers. The last one, "He's not who he says he is," still burned in her mind, a warning she couldn't ignore. She glanced at Jake, who stood at the bar, pouring a whiskey. His movements were as confident as ever, his dark hair slightly disheveled, his shirt unbuttoned to the top button, revealing the tan skin of his neck. But now, Laura saw something else in his confidence, a mask behind which he hid the truth. She hadn't come to the club tonight to drown in his arms, but to find out who he really was. Her heart was pounding, but she forced herself to smile as he handed her the glass. "You seem a little tense today," Jake said, sitting down next to her. His knee brushed against hers, and even that light touch made her skin come alive despite her resolve. "Is something wrong?" "I'm just tired," Laura lied, taking a sip of whiskey to hide the trembling in her hands. "Work, home, you know." "I know," he smiled, but his eyes were attentive, studying. "You always say that when you don't want to tell the truth." Laura froze, her fingers tightening around the glass. She wanted to ask about the folder, about the messages, but she knew he would evade the question again. She needed specifics, proof. Her gaze fell on his phone, lying on the table in the corner of the loft. It was there, open, unlocked, a rare mistake on his part. Laura felt her pulse quicken. This was her chance. "I need to go to the bathroom," she said, standing up and trying to sound casual. "I'll be back in a minute." "Sure," Jake nodded, but his eyes followed her as she walked across the room. Laura closed the bathroom door, but didn't linger. She waited until she heard Jake walk away to the window, then quietly walked back into the room. Her heart was pounding so loudly she was afraid he'd hear it. She grabbed her phone, her fingers shaking as she opened the messaging app. The screen lit up, and she quickly scrolled through the conversation, her eyes darting over the words. One message immediately caught her attention from a contact signed R. "Are you close to her? We need Thompson's account details. She needs to know where he keeps his passwords." Laura felt her blood run cold. She scrolled further, and each message was like a blow. "Keep her on the hook. She trusts you. Thompson's accounts are our prize. Don't screw up. If she asks, blame it on business. She'll buy it." Laura gasped, her hand gripping the phone so tightly the screen flickered. Jake had used her. All of it, his smiles, his touch, his words about freedom, had been a lie. He had been part of some plan to get to Michael's finances through her. She felt her world crumbling, and tears stung her eyes, but she forced herself to breathe. "Laura!" Jake's voice came from behind her, and she jumped, almost dropping the phone. He stood in the doorway, his face dark, his eyes narrowed. "What are you doing?" She turned around, her heart pounding like a hammer. The phone was still in her hand, and she made no attempt to hide it. "Who is R?" Her voice was shaky, but there was steel in it. "And why are you asking about Michael's accounts?" Jake stepped closer, his face becoming more serious, but he didn't look angry, more calculating. "Laura, put the phone down," he said quietly. "You don't know what you're doing." "No, you don't understand," she stepped back, clutching the phone. "I saw the messages. You're using me, Jake. You and this R of yours are after Michael's money." He paused, and his silence was louder than any words. Then he sighed, running his hand through his hair. "It's not," he said, his voice soft, almost pleading. "Yes, I'm involved in things that are complicated, but my feelings for you, they're real. I wasn't lying when I said you deserved more." "You didn't lie," Laura almost screamed, her eyes burning. "You used me, all of this, your club, your words, your..." Touches, it was a plan to get to my husband. Laura, listen. He took a step closer, but she retreated, her back against the wall. Yeah, I had to find out about Michael. That was work. But what we have is not work. I didn't expect that you would become so important to me. Important, she laughed, but the laugh was bitter, like poison. You expect me to believe that, after you lied to me from the start? I didn't lie. His voice grew firmer, and he stepped closer, his eyes full of fire. Yes, I'm involved in things you wouldn't understand. But when I'm with you, I'm real. You felt it, Laura. You know. She wanted to push him away, to scream, but his words struck her in the heart. She remembered their nights, his warmth, his gaze that made her feel alive. But now she saw only betrayal. I don't know who you are, she said, her voice shaking. And I don't want to know. She threw the phone on the couch and ran out of the loft, her heels clicking on the wooden stairs. The club was full, the music was blaring, but Laura couldn't see any faces, couldn't hear any sounds. She pushed through the crowd, her breath ragged, tears stinging her eyes. Outside, the cold air hit her face, but she didn't stop. She ran without looking back until she rounded a corner and slammed into a man in a dark jacket. Be careful, Mrs. Reed, he said, his voice hoarse and with a slight Brooklyn accent. Laura froze, her heart skipping a beat. The man was short, with gray temples and eyes that saw too much. She recognized him, the same one she had seen in the shadows a few days ago. Who are you? Her voice was barely audible. Frank, he pulled a business card out of his pocket and handed it to her. Private detective. Your husband hired me. Laura felt the ground slipping from under her feet. She took the card, her fingers shaking. Does he know? She asked, although the answer was obvious. He knows enough. Frank nodded toward the club. I saw you with that guy, Jake, and I know he's more than just a bartender. You're in trouble, Mrs. Reed. What do you mean? Her voice broke, and she stepped back, clutching the card. I mean, your friend's got connections with people who play for high stakes, Frank said, his eyes cold. And you're an easy target for them. I suggest you be careful. Laura wanted to ask more, but he had already turned and disappeared into the shadows. She stood there, looking at the card that had only a name and a number on it. Her secret was out. Michael knew, and Jake was not who he said he was. She felt her world crumbling, and the tears finally spilled down her cheeks. At home, Laura quietly walked into Oliver's bedroom. He was asleep, hugging his dinosaur, and his face was so calm that Laura felt a pang of pain. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands shaking. She had destroyed everything: her marriage, her family, her life. And all for what? For a man who used her? For the illusion of freedom? She went to bed, but she couldn't sleep. Her thoughts were a mess: the messages on Jake's phone, his words, the detective's gaze. She knew she had to tell Michael, but how? How could she admit to cheating on him, to putting their family in danger? She closed her eyes, but instead of sleep, she saw Jake, his smile, his warmth. And despite everything, part of her still wanted to believe he was being sincere. But the truth was like a knife, and it was already stabbing her heart. Laura stood at the kitchen counter, her fingers curled around the rim of the ceramic cup of cold tea she hadn't finished. Morning light streamed through the window, painting the floor a soft gray, but the house was so quiet that the ticking of the living room clock sounded like a metronome, counting down her last moments of peace. Oliver was asleep upstairs, cuddling his stuffed dinosaur, and Michael was somewhere in the house, his presence a looming storm cloud. It had been a day since she had run into Detective Frank, who had confirmed that Michael knew about her affair with Jake. Laura had been avoiding her husband since then, hiding behind concern for Oliver and working on her laptop, but she knew that she couldn't go on like that forever. The truth hung over her like a knife, and she could feel it piercing her heart. She heard footsteps behind her and turned, her breath catching. Michael was standing in the kitchen doorway, his dark hair slightly disheveled, his shirt rumpled, a rare sight for a man who, even at home, looked like a magazine cover lawyer. His blue eyes were cold, but there was a pain in them that he made no attempt to hide. In his hand, he held a crumpled receipt from the Blue Note Lounge, the same one he'd found in her purse a week ago, the one that had been the beginning of the end. "We need to talk, Laura." His voice was quiet, but there was steel in it, as if he was holding back a storm. "Right now." Laura swallowed, her throat as dry as the desert. She wanted to look away, to run, to hide behind another lie, but she knew there was no turning back. Her fingers tightened around the cup, and she forced herself to sit up straight, even though her knees were shaking. "Okay," she said, setting her cup on the counter. Her voice was hoarse, barely audible. "Let's talk." Michael stepped closer, and the check fell on the table between them like an indictment written in black and white. His eyes bored into hers, and Laura felt her blood run cold. "This," he nodded at the paper, his voice level but furious, "is not one of your design courses. I hired a detective, Laura. I know where you were, and with whom." Her heart skipped a beat, and she felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her pale as a ghost. She opened her mouth to protest, to lie as she had been doing for the past weeks, but the words died in her throat. Michael looked at her, and there was so much pain in his eyes that she could barely breathe. She remembered the pictures Frank had talked about her and Jake walking into the club, his hand on her waist, their silhouettes in the loft window. Her secret was out, and now she stood before her husband as if he were a judge. "Michael, she began, but he interrupted her, his voice growing louder, shaking with suppressed anger. "Don't lie to me." He clenched his fists, his jaw tensing. "I saw the pictures, Laura. You with him, in that damn club, in his loft. Do you think I'm blind? Do you think I don't notice the way you look right through me, like I'm not even there, like I'm nothing?" Laura felt the tears stinging her eyes, but she forced herself to hold them back. She wanted to explain, to tell her how the loneliness was eating away at her insides, how Jake had made her feel alive for the first time in years. But the words would sound pathetic, like excuses, and she knew it. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said, her voice a whisper on the wind. I was lonely, Michael. You're always on your business trips, always busy. I felt invisible, forgotten." Invisible? He almost laughed, but there was no joy in his laughter, only bitterness. "Laura, I work for us. For Oliver, for this house, for those damn courses you never finished. And you run to some bartender because you're lonely." "It's not just the bartender." The words came out before she could stop them, and Laura immediately regretted it. Her voice wavered, and she bit her lip, but it was too late. Michael froze, his face white as if she had struck him. His eyes narrowed, and a fire flared in them, not just anger, but something deeper, like betrayal that was tearing him apart from the inside. "Then it's true," he said, and his voice was like ice, cold and sharp. "You're sleeping with him. Tell me, Laura. Tell me the truth. Right now." She closed her eyes, feeling her world crumble, the walls of their home closing in around her. Lies couldn't save her anymore. She thought of Jake, his warm smile, his touch, his words about freedom. But then she thought of the messages on his phone, the folder with Michael's client's name on it, and her stomach clenched with dread. She couldn't tell Michael everything, that Jake might be a fraud, that he'd used her to get to his accounts. It would destroy their family completely, leave Oliver without a father. She had to protect her son, even if it meant taking all the blame. "Yes," she whispered, opening her eyes. Tears had finally spilled down her cheeks, but she made no attempt to wipe them away. "I was having an affair. I'm sorry, Michael. I didn't want you to know like that." He looked at her, and there was such pain in his eyes that Laura felt her heart breaking. She wanted to go over to him, to touch him, to beg him to forgive her, but his gaze stopped her. It was the look of a man she had betrayed, and no words could fix it. "Sorry." He took a step toward her, his voice shaking with anger. "You think sorry will fix this? 10 years, Laura. 10 years I built our life. I got up every morning to give you and Oliver everything you deserved. And you threw that away for some scoundrel." "It's not like that." She shook her head, her voice full of despair. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I lost myself, Michael. I didn't know how to go on, how to be who you wanted me to be. Who I wanted you to be. His words were like a slap in the face. I wanted you to be my wife, Laura, the mother of our son, and you found yourself in his bed? Do you even realize what you've done? Laura stepped back, her back against the counter. She wanted to scream, to explain that Jake had given her what she hadn't found at home, a sense of being alive, of being wanted. But she couldn't. Not after learning the truth about him. She remembered the messages on his phone. Keep her on the hook. She trusts you. Jake had used her, and it was worse than her own betrayal. I don't know how to explain it, she said, her voice hoarse, tears streaming down her cheeks. But I didn't mean for it to turn out this way. I love Oliver. I still love you. Don't you dare, Michael raised his hand, as if to stop her. His voice was cold as steel, but there was pain in it. Don't you dare talk about love after what you did. Do you think it can be fixed? Do you think I can look at you and not see him? Laura clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to tell him about Jake, about his lies, his cheating, how she had been a pawn in his game. But fear stopped her. If Michael found out she had dragged their family into danger, he would never forgive her. And Oliver didn't deserve to lose them both. Michael turned and walked toward the door, grabbing his coat from the coat rack in the hallway. His movements were jerky, as if he couldn't stand being in the same room with her any longer. Where are you going? Laura followed him, her voice breaking. Michael, please don't go. I need to think, he said without turning around. His voice was cold, but there was a tiredness to it, as if he were giving in. I can't be here. Not now. Michael, she grabbed his hand, her fingers shaking. We can fix this. For Oliver, please. He pulled his hand away, and his gaze was so heavy that Laura felt her heart break. Stay with Oliver, he said, and his voice was like a sentence. One of us has to be his parent. The door slammed shut, and the house fell silent. Laura sank to the floor, her shoulders shaking with sobs. She felt crushed, like her life had fallen into pieces, and she didn't know how to put them back together. She had betrayed Michael, she had betrayed Oliver, she had betrayed herself. But through the tears and the pain, a new emotion was growing in her chest. Determination. She couldn't let Jake destroy her family any more than she had already. She had to act. Laura sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open to the NYPD website. The screen glowed in the dark, casting a blue glow on her face. Her fingers shook as she typed the anonymous message. She closed her eyes, remembering the conversations on Jake's phone she'd seen last night. The messages from R were like poison, each word seared into her memory. We need Thompson's account data. She needs to know where he keeps the passwords. Keep her on the hook. She trusts you. Thompson's accounts are our prize. Don't screw this up. Laura clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms, leaving red marks. Jake was part of a scam, and she was his pawn, a means to get to Michael's finances through his clients. She opened her eyes and began typing. Her fingers moved quickly, the words spilling out as if she were afraid she might change her mind. She wrote everything she could remember. Jake Carter's name, the address of the Blue Note Lounge, the details from the messages, the names Thompson Investments and R, the mentions of accounts and passwords. She didn't mention herself or how she knew it, but she did indicate that Jake might be involved in financial fraud. Her heart pounded as she hit send. The cursor blinked, and the message was gone. Laura leaned back in her chair, breathing hard, as if she'd run a marathon. It was done. Now all she could do was wait. She stood and went to the window, looking out at the dark street. The streetlights cast long shadows, and she thought she saw one of them move, but she forced herself to look away. She couldn't let fear control her anymore. She thought of Oliver, his smile, his blonde hair, his stories about dinosaurs. He was her anchor, her reason to live. She had to protect him, even if it meant destroying what was left of her marriage. Laura walked up to his room, her steps quiet so as not to wake him. He was asleep, hugging his dinosaur, his face so calm that Laura felt a pang of pain. She sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers brushing his cheek, and she swore to herself that she would do anything to keep him from getting hurt. She couldn't fix the past, but she could fight for the future for him. 2 days later, Laura was sitting in her living room when the television she had on in the background suddenly caught her attention. The news anchor was talking about a local event, and her blood ran cold when she heard, "A Brooklyn Jazz Club owner, Jake Carter, was arrested this morning on suspicion of financial fraud." His face flashed across the screen, the familiar dark hair, the warm brown eyes, now cold and unreadable. He stood in handcuffs, surrounded by police officers, but his face was calm, as if he had expected this. Laura grabbed the remote and turned off the TV, her hands shaking. She had done it. She had stopped him. But the relief she expected didn't come. Instead, her chest tightened with pain. She remembered his voice, his touch, his words, "You deserve better." Even after she learned the truth, part of her wanted to believe that he was sincere, that his feelings were real. But now he was in handcuffs, and her life was in ruins. That night, when Laura checked her mail, she found a plain white envelope with no return address among the electric bills and advertising flyers. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter, the handwriting crisp but neat. "Laura, I don't blame you. I knew it wouldn't end well. I dragged you into my game, and I can't forgive myself for that. But you have to know that what happened between us was real. I didn't plan on falling in love with you, but I did. You gave me something I never had before, a sense that I could be better. I'm sorry if I hurt you. Jake." Laura clutched the letter, her fingers crumpling the paper. She wanted to rip it up, burn it, throw it away, as if that could erase everything that had happened. But instead, she opened a drawer and hid the letter under old sketches she had never shown anyone. Her heart was torn between anger and pain. She had made a choice for Oliver, for her family. But the cost of that choice was more than she could bear. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Michael hadn't come home, and his absence was like a void that was swallowing her up. She knew he wouldn't forgive her, and maybe he was right. But Oliver was her anchor, her light in the darkness. For him, she would fight, even if it meant living with a broken heart. Laura sat at the kitchen table in their Brooklyn home, her fingers playing with the edge of the tablecloth as the morning light streamed through the window, painting the room a soft golden color. The only sounds were the ticking of the clock and the distant sounds of the street as Brooklyn woke to the day. Oliver was at school, and Michael had come home last night after 3 days away, and his footsteps upstairs reminded Laura of the fragility of their world. It had been a week since their fight, when she had confessed to having an affair with Jake, and since then the house had felt like a battlefield, where every word, every look was mined. But this morning, Michael had come down to the kitchen with something new in his eyes, not just anger and hurt, but a tired desire to understand. Laura looked up as he walked in, holding a cup of coffee. His dark hair was neatly combed, but there were shadows under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept. He sat down across from her, and his silence was heavy as concrete. Laura clasped her hands under the table, waiting for him to speak first. She was afraid of this conversation, afraid that he would leave again, but she was even more afraid of the silence that grew between them like a chasm. "I talked to Frank," Michael said finally, his voice level, but with a controlled storm in it. "The detective. He told me about your Jake." Laura froze, her heart skipping a beat. She hadn't told Michael about Jake's scam, how he'd used her to get to his clients. She'd been afraid that the truth would make her not only a traitor, but a threat to their family. But now, from the tone of Michael's voice, he knew more than she'd expected. "What did he say?" she asked, her voice hoarse, barely audible. Michael looked at her, and his blue eyes were cold, but there was a hint of sympathy in them, or maybe she just imagined it. "He said Jake Carter wasn't just a club owner," he began, sipping his coffee as if that would help him keep his composure. "He was connected to people who were running financial fraud. They wanted to use you, Laura, to get to my clients, to their accounts. Frank thinks you were a pawn in their game." Laura felt her blood run cold. She knew it. She'd seen the messages on Jake's phone, sent the anonymous letter to the police that had led to his arrest. But hearing it from Michael, Seeing him look at her with not just anger but pity was worse than she could have imagined. I didn't know, she lied, looking down. Her fingers tightened on the edge of the tablecloth, and she forced herself to breathe. Not at first. I thought, I thought he was different. Another? Michael chuckled, but there was no malice in his voice, only weariness. Laura, did you think he would give you what we didn't have? Freedom. Love. What? She looked up, tears stinging her eyelids. She wanted to explain, to tell her how the loneliness was eating away at her insides, how Jake had made her feel alive for the first time in years. But the words would sound pathetic, and she knew it. I was lost, Michael, she said, her voice shaking. You were so far away, always busy, always traveling. I felt like I was disappearing. Jake, he saw me, or I thought he did. Michael looked at her, his face unreadable, as if he was trying to decide whether to believe her or not. I don't know how to look at you now, he said finally, his voice quiet but heavy. You betrayed me, Laura, but now I see that you're a victim too. That bastard used you, and I don't know how to deal with it. Laura swallowed, her throat tightening. She wanted to tell him the truth, that she'd found out about Jake, that she'd sent the information to the police, that she'd wanted to protect their family. But fear stopped her. If Michael found out she'd known about the fraud and not told, he'd never forgive her. And Oliver didn't deserve to lose them both. I don't want Oliver to suffer, she said, her voice full of despair. I'll do anything to make him okay, even if you can't forgive me. Michael leaned back in his chair, his fingers tightening around his cup. I don't want him to suffer either, he said, and for the first time in a long time, there was a flicker of warmth in his voice. But trust, it won't be restored in a day. I want to try, Laura, for him. But I don't know if I can trust you again. She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks, but she made no attempt to wipe them away. What can we do? She asked, her voice barely audible. I found a couples therapist, Michael said, looking into his cup as if he found it easier to talk to his coffee than to her. Dr. Emily Graham. She works with couples who are going through this. I made an appointment for next week, if that's okay with you. Laura froze, her heart clenching. Therapy. It was a step, a small, fragile step, but a step nonetheless. She didn't know if it could save their marriage, but for Oliver's sake, she was willing to try. I agree, she said, her voice firmer than she expected. For Oliver's sake, and for ours. Michael nodded, but his gaze remained cold. That doesn't mean things will go back to the way they were, he said. I don't know if I'll ever forget, but I want Oliver to have a family. Laura clenched her fists under the table, her nails digging into her palms. She knew he was right, the trust was broken, and it wouldn't be mended overnight. But his words, his willingness to try, were a ray of light in the darkness that surrounded her. After the conversation, Laura retreated to her small studio in the corner of the house, a room she'd once set up for design work. She hadn't opened her graphics program since her affair with Jake had begun, but now she felt like she needed something that would give her back control. She turned on her laptop, and the screen lit up, revealing an unfinished project, a logo for a local coffee shop that she'd abandoned months ago. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but then she began working, immersing herself in the lines, the colors, the fonts. It was familiar, it was hers. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. But even as she worked, her thoughts wandered back to Jake. She remembered his smile, his touch, his voice when he said, "You deserve more." The memories were like poison, still coursing through her veins. She hated him for lying to her, for using her, but a part of her, the part that still craved freedom, missed the feeling he gave her. She closed her eyes, pushing his image away, and focused on the screen. This was her way of starting over, of finding herself without destroying everything around her. That night, when Oliver came home from school, Laura sat with him at dinner, listening to him talk about his new dinosaur project. His eyes lit up as he described a T-Rex saving the world from a meteorite, and Laura smiled, feeling her heart lighten. Michael joined them, and though he was silent, His presence was a step forward. They didn't talk about therapy, they didn't talk about the past, but they sat together as a family, and that was enough for now. Laura knew the road to reconciliation would be long. The memories of Jake, his letter, his words of love still burned in her, but she pushed them away like shadows. She looked at Oliver, at his smile, and knew that for him she would find the strength. She didn't know if she could bring Michael back, but she was ready to fight for him, for her son, for herself. 3 months passed like a melody that Laura hadn't had time to catch. October Brooklyn greeted her with a cool breeze and golden leaves carpeting the sidewalks. She stood at the window of their park slope home, looking out onto the street where children rode bikes and the neighbor's dog barked at the mailman. The house was quiet, only the soft ticking of the living room clock reminded her of the time that was moving inexorably forward. Oliver was at school and Michael had left for the office, leaving behind the smell of coffee and the faint echo of their morning conversation. Their lives, once fractured, were now slowly being sewn back together, but the seams were fragile as glass. Laura and Michael had been in couples therapy for 12 weeks now. Every Wednesday, they sat in the cozy office of Dr. Emily Graham, whose warm eyes and calm voice were an anchor in the turbulent sea of their emotions. Therapy was hard. The words they were afraid to say came spilling out, revealing pain, anger, and fear. Michael talked about betrayal, about how her affair with Jake Carter had left a wound in him that still bled. Laura talked about her loneliness, about how she had lost herself in the routine of marriage and motherhood. They were learning to listen to each other, but trust, like a fragile plant, was just beginning to push through the cracks of their past. Laura turned away from the window and walked over to the kitchen table, where her laptop was open to her latest project. She'd finished designing a logo and branding for a local cafe, the Rustic Brew, last week, and yesterday the owner, a bearded man named Tony, had called to tell her that her work had received rave reviews. "You've hit the nail on the head, Laura," he said, his voice full of enthusiasm. "People say our new identity is a breath of fresh air." Laura smiled, remembering his words, and her fingers touched the screen where her logo glowed warm browns, graceful lines inspired by coffee beans. For the first time in a long time, she felt proud, like she'd found a part of herself she'd lost. But even in those moments, her thoughts returned to Jake. His face, dark hair, brown eyes, the slight smile floated in her mind like a shadow she couldn't shake. She hated him for lying to her, for using her to get to Michael's accounts. But his letter, hidden in her desk drawer, still burned in her heart. "I didn't plan to fall in love with you, but I did," he'd written, and the words were like a splinter she couldn't pull out. She tried to forget, but the passion he'd ignited in her had left scars, and they still hurt. The morning began with a familiar rhythm. Laura was making Oliver breakfast oatmeal with honey and banana, his favorite. He sat at the table, swinging his legs and talking about a school project on dinosaurs. His blonde hair fell over his forehead, and Laura brushed it back, smiling. "Mom, did you know that a triceratops could pierce a T-Rex's skull with its horns?" Oliver asked, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. "Seriously?" Laura raised an eyebrow as she placed a plate in front of him. "Is your triceratops the main character now?" "Well, he's like a superhero." Oliver scooped up a spoonful of oatmeal. "He saves everyone from a meteorite. I'll draw this for school." Laura laughed, and her heart felt lighter. Oliver was her anchor, her reason to get up every morning. She looked at him, and the guilt that had haunted her for months receded, though it did not disappear completely. She knew that her choice to stay with her family was the right one, but the cost of that choice still weighed heavily on her shoulders. Michael walked into the kitchen, carrying a briefcase. He was dressed in a dark suit, his hair neatly combed, but there were still shadows of fatigue under his eyes. He looked at Laura, and his gaze was softer than it had been a month ago, but still distant. "Good morning," he said, putting his bag on a chair. "Oliver, ready for school?" "Yeah," Oliver nodded, not looking up from his oatmeal. "Mom, tell Dad about the Triceratops." Laura smiled, but her smile was forced. She looked at Michael, trying to gauge his mood. "He saves the world from meteorites," she said, trying to sound light. Our son is a future screenwriter. Michael nodded, but his gaze lingered on her a little longer than usual. Sounds cool, mate, he said to Oliver, ruffling his hair. Then he turned to Laura. We need to talk. Later. Her stomach sank, but she nodded. Of course, she said, her voice quieter than she intended. Michael left, taking Oliver to school, and Laura was alone. She knew their conversations were never easy. Therapy had helped, but every session was a minefield. Michael was still struggling with her betrayal, and she was still struggling with guilt and memories of Jake. But they were both trying for Oliver, for what was left of their family. Later that evening, Laura sat in Dr. Emily Graham's office, her hands folded in her lap, her fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of her sweater. Michael sat next to her, his posture tense, as if he were preparing for a fight. Emily, with her warm brown eyes and calm smile, looked at them with gentle understanding. Laura, Michael, she began, her voice like warm tea on a cold day. Today, I want you to talk about how you feel right now. Not the past, but the present. What do you want for yourself? For your family? Laura looked at Michael, expecting him to speak first. He cleared his throat, his fingers tightening on the arm of the chair. I want Oliver to grow up in a complete family, he said, his voice even but tired. I want him to not see us fighting, to see us growing apart. But I don't know how to forget Emily. I look at Laura, and part of me still sees her with him. Laura felt her throat tighten. She wanted to protest, to say that she wasn't the woman who'd run off to the club, but the words stuck. Instead, she took a deep breath and spoke. I want the same thing, she said, her voice shaking, but she forced herself to continue. I want Oliver to be happy. I know what I did, Michael. I know I broke your trust, but I'm trying. I'm working on myself, on my design, on being the mother he deserves. I don't want him to pay for my mistakes. Michael looked at her, and there was something new in his eyes, not just pain, but a hint of understanding. I can see you're trying, he said quietly. Your project, I saw you working on it. I'm proud of you, Laura, but it doesn't erase what happened. I know, she nodded, her eyes filling with tears. But I want us to try, not for me, but for him. Emily nodded, her smile encouraging. It's a good step, she said. You both want the same thing, a family for Oliver. That's the foundation. But you need time to rebuild trust. Michael, what can you do to feel closer to Laura? He fell silent, his gaze falling to the floor. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe just be here, talk, don't run. Laura felt her heart squeeze. This was more than she expected. And I can listen, she said, her voice soft. And be honest, even if it hurts. Emily smiled, her eyes full of warmth. This is a beginning, she said. Small steps, but they are important. The next day, Laura decided to do something she hadn't done in months. She drove to the Blue Note Lounge. The club was under new management. Jake's partners had sold the place after his arrest, and the new owner had updated the interior but kept the spirit of the jazz haven. Laura walked in, her heart pounding, but she forced herself to walk to the bar and order a soda. The music, the soft notes of a saxophone washed over her like an old blanket, and she closed her eyes, letting the melody carry her away. She remembered her nights here, with Jake, his voice, his touch, his promises of freedom. These memories were like scars, painful but no longer bleeding. She knew he had lied, that he had used her, but part of her still missed the feeling he had given her. Not him, but the Laura who had felt alive, wanted. Now she was learning to find that feeling in herself, in her work, in Oliver's smile, in the fragile hope of reconciliation with Michael. She finished her soda and walked outside, her breath mixing with the cold October air. The club was no longer her refuge, but it reminded her of who she was and who she could become. She was not only a wife, not only a mother, but a woman who could create, who could fight, who could love. On Saturday, Laura took Oliver to Prospect Park. He ran around the grass waving his toy dinosaur, his laugh ringing like a bell. Michael joined them, and though he kept his distance, he smiled as Oliver showed him his dinosaur fight. Laura looked at her son, at his joy, and her heart filled with warmth. She knew she had made the right choice to stay with her family. But the scars from her past from Jake, from her mistakes, were still there. They would always be a part of her, but she was learning to live with them. She looked at Michael, and their eyes met. There was no warmth in his gaze, but there was hope, small and fragile, but real. Laura smiled, and he nodded slightly. This was not the end, but the beginning. A new rhythm that they would find together. Laura walked the snowy sidewalks of Park Slope, her wool coat tucked tightly around her shoulders against the January wind that swirled snowflakes through the cold Brooklyn air. It was the morning of January 17th, 2026, and the city seemed quiet, wrapped in a blanket of white, the streetlights casting a soft golden glow over the drifts. She carried a bag of groceries in her arms, milk, eggs, some of Oliver's favorite fresh rolls from the corner bakery. It had been 4 months since Jake Carter, her former lover, had been arrested for financial fraud, 3 months since she had started couples therapy with Michael, and 2 months since her design for the rustic brew had received rave reviews in the local paper. Laura's life slowly found a new rhythm, but every step was like walking on thin ice, fragile, but promising hope for solid ground. She paused at the mailbox in front of their house, her breath curling into the frosty air, creating little clouds that dissolved into the cold. Amid the electric bills and flyers offering winter specials, her gaze fell on a simple postcard. On the front was a silhouette of a jazz saxophonist playing under a lone lamp, black and white with gold accents, like those nights at the Blue Note Lounge. Laura frowned, her fingers hovering over the paper, as if sensing trouble. She turned the card over, and her heart skipped a beat. The handwriting was familiar, crisp but neat, with slight flourishes on the L's. It was from Jake. Laura walked into the house, throwing her bag onto the kitchen table with such force that the milk carton nearly toppled over. She sank into a chair, her fingers shaking as she held the card in both hands, as if it were a bomb ready to explode. The house was quiet. Oliver was at school. Michael was away at his office in Manhattan, and only the ticking of the clock in the living room broke the silence. She took a deep breath and began to read. Laura, I'm writing this from a place where I have too much time to think, and all I can think about is you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I lured you into my game, used you to get to your husband's accounts, and I have no excuse. But you need to know, you were the only real thing in my life. I wasn't lying when I said I loved you. Even now, here, within four walls, I see your eyes, your smile. You gave me something I never had before, the feeling that I could be better. I'm sorry for everything. Jake. Laura clutched the card so hard the edges crumpled, leaving marks on her palms. Her chest tightened as if someone had squeezed all the air out of her. She hated him for lying, for betraying her, for using her weakness to get at Michael's finances through his clients. She remembered the messages on his phone she'd found that night. Keep her on the hook. She trusted you. She remembered sending the anonymous letter to the police, seeing his face on the news, surrounded by cops, handcuffed. She'd done it to protect her family, but his words, written in black ink, were like poison coursing through her veins. Her thoughts went back to those nights in his loft. The smell of whiskey, the soft glow of the lamp, the sound of the saxophone piercing through the floor. His hands on her waist, his voice whispering, "You deserve more." Those moments had been like a fire that had ignited life within her, but left only ashes. She hated herself for still remembering his warmth, the way he'd looked at her and made her feel wanted. But now she knew the truth. He was a liar, a manipulator, and his love, if there had been any, was poisoned by his motives. Laura stood, her movements sharp, determined. She walked into the living room, where the fireplace stood cold and empty. They rarely lit it, but today she felt it was necessary. She took the matches from the shelf, her fingers shaking as she struck one. The flame flared, small but hungry, and Laura held the card to the flames. The paper caught quickly, the black edges curling, Jake's words disappearing in the orange flames. She watched the card turn to ash, and her breathing became more regular. This was not just an act of destruction. It was the closing of a door she had held ajar for too long. Jake had been her mistake, her weakness, but he had no power over her anymore. "Mom," Oliver's voice came from the hallway, and Laura started, turning around. Her son ran into the house, his cheeks pink from the cold, his backpack slung over one shoulder, and in his hands he held a piece of paper with a drawing on it. "I've made up a new story. Dinosaurs are flying in a spaceship now." Laura smiled, her heart filling with warmth that melted the cold inside. She walked over to him, brushing snowflakes from his blonde hair, and crouched down to be level with his shining eyes. "A spaceship?" she asked, raising an eyebrow, her voice soft and full of love. "Who's the captain of this ship?" "Triceratops, of course," Oliver laughed, waving a drawing of a horned dinosaur in a spacesuit standing at the helm. "He's the coolest. He saves everyone from a meteorite, and then they have a party in space." "A party in space?" Laura laughed, her laughter genuine for the first time in a long time. "Is that dinosaurs dancing to jazz?" "Maybe," Oliver giggled, throwing his backpack on the floor. "Mom, will you draw me a jazz dinosaur?" "A jazz dinosaur." She pulled him into her arms, feeling his warmth chase away the last shadows of the past. "It's a challenge, but I can handle it. Deal." "Deal." He hugged her back, and Laura closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of his shampoo and snow. Oliver was her anchor, her reason to get up every morning, her light in the darkness. She knew that her choice to stay with her family, to fight for them, was the right one, even if it left scars on her heart. The door opened and Michael walked in, brushing snow from his dark coat. His eyes met hers, and there was a cautious warmth in them, not like the first years of their marriage, when they'd laughed at silly jokes and danced in the kitchen, but something new, fragile, like the first snow. He set his briefcase down by the door and looked at Oliver, who was already running toward him with the drawing. "Dad, look." Oliver thrust the sheet into Michael's hands. "This is my space Triceratops." Michael smiled, and his smile was genuine, if tired. He crouched down, looking at the drawing, and his fingers touched his son's shoulder. "Is he the only one steering the ship?" he asked, his voice soft. "Do you think he needs an assistant?" "Maybe the Tyrannosaurus." Oliver jumped, his eyes shining. "But he has to listen to the Triceratops because he's the boss." "Fair enough," Michael laughed, his gaze sliding to Laura. "Looks like we have a director growing up." Laura nodded, her lips twitching into a smile. She could feel the current running between them, not passion, not fire, like with Jake, but something deeper, like the roots of a tree holding him through a storm. Their marriage was far from perfect, and therapy with Dr. Emily Graham had been a slow dance, each step an effort. They talked about the pain, the betrayal, the way Laura had lost herself and Michael had lost his trust. But they both wanted the same thing, a family for Oliver, and that kept them together, even when the words cut like knives. "How was your day?" Michael asked, standing up and looking at Laura. His voice was neutral, but there was an attempt in it, an attempt to be closer than yesterday. "Okay," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I've started a new project, a poster for a jazz festival. I think, I think it's going to be something special." Michael nodded, and a small but real glimmer of pride flickered in his eyes. "I saw your logo for the cafe," he said, his voice quieter. "It's everywhere, Laura. You're talented. I always knew it." She felt her cheeks warm and looked down to hide her emotions. His words were like a bridge. They were rebuilding, slowly, brick by brick. "Thank you," she said, her voice shaking. "It means a lot." Oliver tugged at Michael's sleeve, demanding his attention, and the moment dissolved into his laughter. Laura watched them, and her heart filled with warmth. They weren't the same, but they were learning to be together, imperfectly, but truly. That evening, after Oliver had fallen asleep, Laura retreated to her studio, a small room in the corner of the house where her sketches covered the walls and her desk was littered with pencils and a tablet. She turned on the lamp, and warm light spilled into the room, illuminating her laptop. She opened a graphics program, her fingers hovering over the tablet, but then moving, drawing fluid lines inspired by the sounds of jazz. She thought of the Blue Note lounge, the smell of whiskey, the soft light, the melodies that enveloped her like smoke. Her sketch for the jazz festival had been bold black and gold, silhouettes of musicians, lines that flowed like music, full of life and movement. As she worked, Laura allowed herself to remember those nights with Jake. His voice, his touch, his promises of freedom. The memories no longer hurt, but left a slight yearning not for him, but for the Laura who had sought herself in forbidden passion. Now she found herself here, in her sketches, in Oliver's laughter, in Michael's cautious glances. She finished the sketch and leaned back in her chair, looking at the screen. The lines merged into the image of a saxophonist, lonely but strong, like herself. For the first time in a long time, she smiled not forced, not out of a sense of duty, but sincerely, as if she had found a part of herself that she had long lost. She turned off the lamp and went into the living room, where Michael was sitting on the sofa, leafing through a book. He looked up, and their eyes met. There was no warmth in his gaze, but there was hope, small and fragile, but real. Laura sat down next to him, not touching him, but feeling his presence like a soft melody. "I drew something," she said, her voice soft. "Want to see it?" He nodded, and she brought out the tablet, showing the sketch. Michael looked closely, his fingers touching the screen as if he wanted to feel the lines. "It's beautiful, Laura," he said, and his voice was sincere. "It's you." She smiled, and her heart felt lighter. They didn't talk about the past, they didn't talk about the pain, but in that moment they were together, not as the husband and wife of their old life, but as two people learning anew. Laura looked out the window, where the snow was falling in soft flakes, blanketing Brooklyn in white. Her scars, Jake, her mistakes, her pain were a part of her, like notes in a melody that made her unique. But now she heard a new rhythm, her own echo of midnight, and she was ready to dance to it. The uncertainty of the future was scary, but there was hope in it, bright as a star in the night sky, and Laura knew she would find her way. You are the best. Subscribe, like, and see you in new stories. Yes, I slept with him. Laura exhaled almost soundlessly, as if she had shot herself in the chest. The heavy silence absorbed the confession, and Michael's eyes flared with that empty, cold flame that burns slower than fire. Every Tuesday I flew. Laura Reed lives in Brooklyn and feels like a ghost. Her lawyer husband Michael is always away on business. Her 8-year-old Oliver demands attention, and her dreams of becoming an artist are gathering dust in a drawer. One night, escaping loneliness, Laura goes to a jazz club, Blue Note Lounge, and meets the bartender and owner, Jake Carter. The music, the warm light, and his ability to see people awaken a long-forgotten liveliness in her. Once again, she returns to the club, then to his loft. An affair begins that seems like salvation. At the same time, Michael, noticing her coldness from the club, hires a private detective. Soon Laura herself finds a folder with documents of Michael's clients and correspondence with someone R. Keep her on the hook, we need account data. Realizing that she is a pawn in a fraudulent scheme, she anonymously passes the information to the police. Jake is arrested. The truth about the betrayal comes out. Michael sees the photos and leaves, leaving Laura with a son and broken trust. The house fills with heavy silence, but both decide to fight for Oliver. They begin family therapy. Laura returns to design, creates a successful project for a local cafe, and learns to be honest. A few months later, after a series of painful sessions and small steps towards each other, the relationship is still fragile, but alive. Michael is ready to try. Laura is burning the last postcard from Jake from prison and is busy with a poster for a jazz festival. The scars of the past remain, but the family gradually finds a new rhythm, and Laura her voice and place next to her son and husband.